What if the family that threw you away was hiding a secret that could destroy them? When 26-year-old Elias was banished from his wealthy family with nothing but the clothes on his back, he thought his life was over. Instead, a crumbling cellar wall revealed a tunnel and a multi-million-dollar lie. The rain in Boston was relentless the day Elias Montgomery was erased from his own family. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of gray, miserable morning that seeps into your bones. Elias stood in the center of his father's sprawling, mahogany-lined office on the 42nd floor of the Montgomery Logistics Tower, dripping wet and shivering. But the cold he felt didn't come from the weather. It came from the man sitting behind the massive glass desk. Richard Montgomery, a titan of East Coast real estate and shipping, didn't even look up from his tablet as he delivered the final blow. "You're done, Elias," Richard said, his voice as flat and unyielding as a slab of marble. "The trust is frozen. The credit cards are cancelled. Your access to the company servers was revoked an hour ago. You will pack your apartment by noon, or I will have building security throw your belongings onto the street." Elias stared at his father, his chest tight with a suffocating mix of anger and disbelief. Beside Richard stood Preston, Elias's older brother, the golden child, the perfect corporate soldier. Preston wore a tailored Italian suit and a faint, unbearable smirk. The crime that had led to Elias's excommunication? Honesty. For months, Elias had been working as a junior project manager for the family firm. He had discovered a series of deeply buried financial discrepancies, millions of dollars funneled out of the pension fund of a recently acquired manufacturing plant and into a web of offshore shell companies. When Elias brought the evidence to his father, expecting righteous fury, he was met instead with immediate, terrifying retaliation. Richard wasn't the victim of the embezzlement. He was the architect of it. And Preston was his willing accomplice. "You're making a mistake, Dad," Elias pleaded, his voice cracking. "This is a felony. When the SEC finds out..." "The SEC will find nothing," Richard interrupted, finally looking up. His eyes were devoid of any paternal warmth. "Because you are going to keep your mouth shut. If you breathe a word of this to anyone, I will ensure you spend the rest of your life buried under so much litigation you won't be able to afford a cup of coffee. You are a naive, ungrateful child. You are no longer a Montgomery." Just like that, 26 years of family history were severed. By nightfall, Elias was sitting in the driver's seat of his 10-year-old sedan, the only asset solely in his name. His bank account held exactly $412. He had nowhere to go. His friends from the Boston social scene had miraculously stopped answering his texts the moment rumors of his disinheritance leaked. He had only one lifeline left, and it was a fragile one. 2 years prior, his great-aunt Harriet, a reclusive, eccentric woman who had been estranged from the Montgomery family for decades, had passed away. To everyone's shock, she had bypassed Richard entirely and left her only property to Elias, a boy she had only met twice. Richard had laughed at the inheritance at the time, calling it a useless pile of rotting timber. It was a dilapidated, mid-19th century farmhouse situated on 20 acres of overgrown land near Orono, Maine. Elias had never even been there. But right now, a rotting roof was better than no roof at all. The drive north was a blur of highway lights and crushing despair. When Elias finally pulled up to the property just after dawn, the reality of his situation hit him with the force of a physical blow. The house was a nightmare. The paint was peeling in massive grey scabs. The front porch sagged under its own weight, strangled by dead ivy. One of the front windows was shattered, boarded up with a piece of warped plywood. For the first 3 weeks, survival was Elias's only focus. The isolation was deafening. He had no internet, barely any cell service, and his diet consisted of cheap, canned soup cooked over a rusted wood-burning stove. The November chill was setting in, and the house leaked heat like a sieve. He spent his days exhausted, doing manual labor, chopping firewood, patching holes in the roof with tarps, and sealing windows with duct tape. The physical pain in his blistered hands was a welcome distraction from the emotional agony of his family's betrayal. The turning point came in mid-November. The farmhouse had a sprawling fieldstone basement that flooded every time it rained. A foul, stagnant smell had begun to seep up through the floorboards into the kitchen. Knowing the winter freezes would expand the standing water and crack the foundation further, Elias ventured down into the dark, damp cellar to find the source of the blockage. Armed with a heavy-duty flashlight and a rusted pickaxe he'd found in the barn, Elias waded into ankle-deep, freezing mud. The walls of the basement were made of massive, uneven stones, mortared together over a century ago. Tucked in the darkest corner, behind an old, broken oil tank, Elias found what looked like a collapsed drainage pipe, packed solid with hard clay and debris. He raised the pickaxe and drove it into the mud. Thud. He swung again. Thud. He swung a third time, putting his back into it, aiming slightly higher at the stone wall where the clay seemed thickest. Clang. The impact sent a violent shockwave up Elias's arms, rattling his teeth. He dropped the pickaxe, his hand stinging. That wasn't the sound of steel hitting stone. That was the unmistakable, hollow ring of steel hitting heavy iron. Frowning, Elias grabbed his flashlight and knelt in the mud. He used his bare, freezing hands to claw away the thick layer of packed dirt and crumbling mortar. As the grime fell away, he didn't uncover a pipe. He uncovered a hinge. His heart picked up a strange, erratic rhythm. He kept digging, frantically tearing at the wall, ignoring the sharp rocks scraping his knuckles. What he had assumed was a solid foundation wall was actually a false facade. Behind a thin layer of decorative fieldstone and decades of packed earth lay a massive, heavily rusted iron door, roughly 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide. It was built directly into the foundation, leading out into the earth beyond the house. There was no handle, just a heavy, rotating lock wheel in the center, like something you would find on a nautical bulkhead or a bank vault. Elias sat back on his heels, his breath pluming in the freezing basement air. What in the world had Great-Aunt Harriet been hiding? It took Elias 3 agonizing days to breach the door. The locking wheel was fused solid by decades of rust and moisture. He exhausted half his meager cash supply at the local hardware store, buying cans of penetrating oil, a heavy sledgehammer, and a blowtorch. He worked like a man possessed. The misery of his eviction, the cold, the hunger, it all vanished, replaced by a burning, obsessive curiosity. He spent hours in the damp cellar, torching the iron wheel to heat the metal, then pounding it with the sledgehammer, trying to break the rust's grip. On the evening of the 3rd day, under the harsh, yellow glare of a battery-powered work light, Elias gave the wheel one final, desperate strike with the hammer. Crack! A shower of orange rust flakes exploded into the air. Elias dropped the hammer, grabbed the heavy iron spokes with both hands, and threw his entire body weight to the left. With a horrific, high-pitched screech of metal scraping against metal, the wheel turned. He spun it until it locked, then grabbed the edge of the heavy door and pulled. It was incredibly heavy, fighting him every inch of the way, but it finally swung open. Elias stumbled back, coughing, a rush of air expelled from the opening. It wasn't the damp, earthy smell of a root cellar he expected. The air was surprisingly dry, carrying the faint, distinct scent of ozone, old paper, and something metallic, like copper. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight and aimed the beam into the void. His jaw dropped. He had expected a small, dirt-carved smuggler's hole, perhaps left over from the Prohibition era. Instead, the beam of his flashlight illuminated a highly sophisticated, structurally sound tunnel. The walls, floor, and ceiling were lined with smooth, reinforced concrete. Thick black electrical cables ran along the ceiling in neat, professional conduits. It looked like a military bunker, not a farmhouse cellar. "What is this?" Elias whispered aloud, his voice echoing eerily down the corridor. He stepped over the threshold, his boots clicking softly on the concrete. The tunnel sloped gently downward, heading in the direction of the dense woods at the rear of the property. Every 20 feet, there were glass-caged industrial light bulbs mounted to the ceiling, all dark and dead. Elias walked slowly, sweeping his light side to side. The tunnel was perfectly straight and went on for roughly 200 yards. Given the depth and the slope, Elias calculated he had to be at least 30 feet underground. Who had the money and resources to build this? His great-aunt Harriet had lived like a pauper, wearing moth-eaten cardigans and driving a rusted Volvo. Constructing a subterranean passage like this would have required heavy machinery, a team of engineers, and millions of dollars. The tunnel ended abruptly at a heavy steel security door, the kind used in commercial panic rooms. Unlike the rusted hatch in the basement, this door was pristine, coated in thick grey enamel. Next to the handle was an electronic keypad, the plastic buttons yellowed with age. Elias's stomach sank. If it was electronically locked, he had no power to bypass it. He reached out and tugged the heavy steel handle in frustration. To his absolute shock, the handle depressed with a heavy click. The door wasn't locked. It had been pulled shut, but the deadbolt had never been engaged. Elias pulled the door open and stepped inside, sweeping his flashlight across the room. He was standing in a windowless, subterranean office that looked like it had been sealed in a time capsule. The room was roughly 20 by 20 feet. Against the far wall sat a massive antique mahogany desk, identical to the one his father sat behind in Boston. Behind the desk were 4 towering steel filing cabinets, and sitting in the corner, dominating the space, was a matte black Diebold safe, easily the size of a refrigerator. The air here was completely still and thick with dust. Elias walked toward the desk, noticing a thin layer of grey film covering everything. He wiped his hand across the leather top of the desk, leaving a clean streak. Sitting perfectly centered on the desk was a leather-bound journal and an old cassette tape recorder. Elias picked up the journal. The leather was dry and cracked. He opened it to the first page. Written in elegant, sweeping cursive handwriting was a single sentence. "If you are reading this, Richard has finally gone too far, and you have found your way home." Elias's breath hitched. Richard. His father. He flipped the page. The journal wasn't a diary, it was a ledger. Page after page of handwritten entries, dates, bank account routing numbers, and names. Elias recognized several of the names. They were state senators, union bosses, and shell companies that he had seen in the Montgomery logistics servers before his father had locked him out. But these entries dated back to the 1980s, before Elias was even born. Trembling, Elias opened the top drawer of the desk. Inside was a thick manila folder labeled simply, "The Origin." He pulled it out and opened it under the beam of his flashlight. The first document was a yellowed partnership agreement from 1982. It outlined the creation of a company called Vanguard Holdings. There were 3 signatures at the bottom. The first was his father's, Richard Montgomery. The second was his great-aunt Harriet's. The third signature made Elias's blood turn to ice. It was a name he had never heard before in his life, Thomas Sterling. Attached to the partnership agreement was a series of birth certificates and a heavily redacted police report from 1986 detailing a fatal car crash. Elias thumbed to the next document. It was a DNA paternity test, dated exactly 26 years ago, the year he was born. He read the names on the laboratory result. Subject A, father, Thomas Sterling. Subject B, child, Elias Montgomery. Result, 99.9% probability of paternity. The flashlight slipped from Elias's hand, clattering loudly against the concrete floor, casting wild, spinning shadows across the vault. Richard Montgomery wasn't his father. Elias dropped into the heavy leather chair behind the desk, his mind spinning violently. He wasn't the outcast black sheep of the Montgomery family. He wasn't a Montgomery at all. He was a Sterling. But who was Thomas Sterling? And why had Richard raised him? Elias looked at the massive Diebold safe in the corner. Then he looked back at the cassette recorder on the desk. Next to it lay a single tape, labeled in his great-aunt's handwriting, "For Elias. Press play." Elias's hand shook as he reached for the cassette recorder. He pressed the heavy, mechanical play button. For a few seconds, there was only the hollow hiss of magnetic tape sliding over the reader. Then, a voice cut through the silence of the underground vault. "If you are hearing this, Elias, it means my heart has finally failed me, and Richard has inevitably shown you his true face." It was Great-Aunt Harriet. Her voice was raspy, laced with a heavy New England cadence, but possessed an underlying steel that Elias had never heard during their brief encounters. "I imagine you are confused," the recording continued, the sound of a match striking and a deep exhale of smoke following her words. "You are sitting in a room that does not officially exist, looking at documents that Richard Montgomery has spent tens of millions of dollars trying to find and destroy. By now, you've seen the paternity test. I know how much it hurts to have your reality shattered, but you must listen to me carefully. The man who raised you is not your father. He is your father's murderer." Elias gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, his knuckles turning white. The air in the bunker suddenly felt too thin to breathe. "Your real father was Thomas Sterling," Harriet's voice echoed from the small speaker. "Thomas was a visionary. In 1982, before computers were on every desk, Thomas wrote a predictive logistics algorithm, a piece of software that could route shipping freighters and ground transport with zero overlap and maximum fuel efficiency. It was a revolutionary piece of code. It was the foundation of what would eventually become Montgomery Logistics." Elias stared at the spinning cassette wheels, mesmerized and horrified. He knew the algorithm Harriet was talking about. It was still the backbone of the company's entire global infrastructure, updated over the decades, but functionally the same. Richard had always claimed he coded it himself in a garage. Thomas needed capital to scale the software, Harriet explained. He partnered with Richard, who had inherited a modest real estate fortune. I was the third partner, providing the operational framework. We called it Vanguard Holdings. For 3 years, we were unstoppable. But Richard was never a builder, Elias. He was a parasite. When Vanguard was on the verge of $1 billion public offering, Richard demanded Thomas sign over the sole patent rights to the algorithm. Thomas refused. He threatened to take his code and walk away, leaving Richard with nothing but empty warehouses. The tape crackled. Elias could hear the profound grief weighing down the old woman's voice. 2 days later, on November 14th, 1986, Thomas's brakes failed on a sharp curve along the Mount Washington Auto Road. His car went over the embankment. He was killed instantly. You were 6 months old. Elias felt a tear break loose, tracking a hot line down his dust-covered cheek. He had always felt like an alien in the Montgomery household. Richard had treated him with a cold, clinical detachment, while Preston was showered with praise and resources. Now, the monstrous truth was staring him in the face. Richard hadn't raised Elias out of charity. He had raised him as a trophy, keeping the son of his vanquished rival under his heel, forcing him to work for the very empire stolen from his true father, was the ultimate sadistic victory. "I knew it wasn't an accident," Harriet said. "I hired a private investigator, a man named Frank Donovan. Frank spent a year digging through the mud. He found the mechanic Richard paid off to cut the brake lines. He got it on tape. But when I confronted Richard, he laughed at me. He told me that he owned the Boston police commissioner, and if I went public, he would ensure that you, Thomas's infant son, would meet a tragic, sudden end, just like your father. I was terrified, Elias. I traded my silence for your life. I moved to Maine, bought this property, and hired a private engineering firm from Montreal to build this vault. I have spent the last 30 years hoarding the evidence, waiting for the day you were old enough and angry enough to use it." The tape clicked, signaling the end of the recording. Elias sat in the suffocating silence of the bunker for a long time. The despair that had dragged him to this frozen wasteland was gone, incinerated by a raging, white-hot fury. He stood up and turned his attention to the massive black Diebold safe in the corner. He didn't need to guess the combination. He walked back to the desk, opened the leather-bound journal to the very back page, and found a sequence of numbers written in red ink. 11-14-86. The day his real father died. Elias walked over to the safe, his hand steady. He spun the heavy brass dial, right to 11, left to 14, right to 86. He grabbed the handle and pulled. With a heavy metallic clunk, the bolts retracted, and the thick steel door swung open. Inside the safe were 3 shelves. The top shelf held a stack of heavy, magnetic data tapes, the original source code for the Vanguard algorithm, written and copyrighted by Thomas Sterling. The middle shelf held a series of microcassettes, labeled with Frank Donovan's name. But it was the bottom shelf that made Elias gasp. Neatly stacked in rows were bundles of bearer bonds and certified offshore bank drafts. Harriet hadn't just saved the evidence. She had spent 30 years quietly siphoning her legal share of the Vanguard dividends, hiding it away from Richard's gaze. Elias picked up one of the bundles. It was easily $100,000. There were dozens of them. Harriet had left him the weapon to destroy Richard and the ammunition to fund the war. Elias looked around the subterranean room, a grim, determined smile touching his lips. He wasn't Elias Montgomery anymore. He was Elias Sterling, and he was going back to Boston. 4 months later. March. The Montgomery Logistics Q1 shareholder meeting was the crown jewel of Boston's corporate calendar. It was held in the grand ballroom of the Omni Parker House, a space dripping with crystal chandeliers and gold leaf molding. Over 300 people were in attendance, major investors, hedge fund managers, and financial journalists. At the front of the room, standing on a raised stage behind a sleek acrylic podium, was Richard Montgomery. He looked as imposing as ever in a bespoke charcoal suit, projecting the aura of an untouchable titan. Beside him sat Preston, nodding along as Richard presented a slide deck showing record-breaking quarterly profits. "Our offshore expansion into the Southeast Asian shipping corridors has yielded a 40% reduction in overhead," Richard announced into the microphone, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Montgomery Logistics is not just a company. It is an institution built on integrity, foresight, and relentless innovation." At the back of the ballroom, the heavy, brass-studded oak doors swung open. Elias walked in. He wasn't wearing the cheap, off-the-rack suits he used to wear as a junior project manager. He wore a razor-sharp, midnight blue Tom Ford suit purchased with his great-aunt's bearer bonds. He looked entirely different. His posture was straight, his eyes burning with a dangerous, quiet confidence. Flanking Elias were 3 people. To his right was Oliver Reed, the most feared corporate litigator in Manhattan, a man whose hourly rate could bankrupt a small country. To his left were 2 men wearing dark suits and stern expressions, special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's white-collar crime division. The low murmur of the ballroom faded into a stunned silence as Elias walked down the center aisle. The click of his leather shoes on the marble floor sounded like the ticking of a bomb. Richard stopped mid-sentence. His eyes locked onto Elias, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. He leaned into the microphone. "Security," Richard barked, his voice losing its polished veneer. "Remove this man immediately. He is trespassing." 2 burly security guards stepped into the aisle to intercept Elias, but the FBI agents simultaneously flashed their gold badges. The guards immediately backed away, raising their hands in surrender. Elias didn't stop until he was standing 10 feet from the stage, looking directly up at the man who had stolen his life. "Hello, Richard," Elias said. His voice wasn't amplified, but in the dead silence of the room, it carried perfectly. Preston jumped up from his chair, pointing a trembling finger. "Elias, what the hell do you think you're doing? You were explicitly banned from this building." "I'm not here to see you, Preston," Elias said coolly. He turned his gaze back to Richard. "I'm here to reclaim stolen property, specifically Vanguard Holdings." A collective gasp rippled through the audience of shareholders. Very few people remembered the name Vanguard, but those who did knew it was the genesis of the Montgomery Empire. Richard forced a cold, patronizing laugh. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this interruption. This is my estranged, deeply troubled son. He has been struggling with severe delusions for some time." "I'm not your son," Elias said, the words striking like physical blows. Oliver Reed stepped forward, opening a sleek leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and handed them to the front row of journalists. "My client's name is Elias Sterling," Oliver Reed announced, his voice booming with theatrical authority. "He is the sole biological heir of Thomas Sterling, the true architect and legal copyright holder of the routing algorithm that this company is built upon. We are filing a civil suit for intellectual property theft, seeking total liquidation of Montgomery Logistics to recover $94 billion in stolen revenue." The ballroom erupted into chaos. Camera flashes strobed like lightning. Investors shouted over each other, demanding answers. "This is absurd!" Richard roared over the noise, slamming his fist on the podium. "Thomas Sterling died in an accident 30 years ago. I built this company with my own bare hands. This is a pathetic attempt at extortion." Elias calmly reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a small, modern digital audio player. He had spent weeks digitizing Harriet's tapes. He plugged a wireless transmitter into the bottom of the device, which Oliver Reed had pre-synced to the ballroom's massive surround sound system during a technical check earlier that morning. "You didn't build it, Richard," Elias said, staring dead into his enemy's eyes. "You stole it, and then you slaughtered the builder." Elias pressed play. The scratchy, unmistakable voice of Frank Donovan, the private investigator, filled the massive room. "State your name for the record." A second voice, shaking and terrified, echoed off the chandeliers. Arthur Penhaligon. I was a mechanic at the South Street garage." "And what did Richard Montgomery pay you $25,000 to do on the night of November 13th, 1986? There was a long pause on the tape, and then the confession that would destroy an empire. He paid me to bleed the brake fluid and sever the primary hydraulic line on Thomas Sterling's Volvo. He said it had to look like a blowout on the mountain pass. The ballroom went deathly silent. The air was sucked completely out of the room. Investors who had just been cheering Richard's profits were now staring at him in unadulterated horror. Richard Montgomery looked like a man who had just been struck by a falling safe. His face drained of all color, turning an ashen, sickly gray. His hands trembled so violently he had to grip the edges of the podium to stay upright. For the first time in his life, the great titan of industry had absolutely nothing to say. Preston backed away from his father, his eyes wide with panic, realizing the ship was sinking and taking everyone down with it. One of the FBI agents stepped onto the stage, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Richard Montgomery," the agent said, his voice flat and authoritative. "You are under arrest for the conspiracy and murder of Thomas Sterling, as well as multiple counts of federal wire fraud and embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent." As the cuffs clicked around Richard's wrists, he finally met Elias's eyes. There was no defiance left in the old man's gaze, only the hollow, terrifying realization of a cornered animal realizing the trap had finally snapped shut. Elias didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply watched as the man who had tormented him for 2 decades was led off the stage in disgrace, his legacy reduced to ashes in front of the entire world. Standing on the front porch of the newly restored Orono farmhouse, Elias Sterling breathed in the crisp Maine air. The Montgomery Empire was ashes, dismantled to compensate the victims of Richard's decades-long fraud. Elias hadn't just found a fortune in the dark. He had found his identity. Some secrets are buried to hide the truth, but others wait patiently for the right person to unearth them and demand absolute justice.